Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast. I'm Scott, and joining me for this Grand Royale episode, the Prince of Piquant to my Duke of Droll, it's Kimber. Hey, Kimber, how you doing?
Hey, Scott. Great to be back.
Yeah, I am totally glad to have you back on the Mothership Podcast here, as you were kind enough to appear, I believe, 3 times in a row this past year on my Scott Forgot the 80s podcast. So glad to have you back here, of course.
And everybody should check out that podcast.
That's right. We were talking about it just moments ago. An eclectic bunch that we covered in our 3 separate podcasts. It was Red Dawn, Pretty in Pink, and Excalibur. And which is kind of fun because now you return to look at a somewhat more grounded view of British royalty by finishing what you and I started a few years back, our coverage of the final season of The Crown.
Yeah, there's no shiny armor in this season, but there's plenty of fantasy.
Yeah. Well, it's historical fiction, not a documentary. Okay. You know what? I'm glad you made a joke like that because it's something that's kind of been a bugaboo of mine with people, and I've been a little guilty of it myself, perhaps over time. But I always feel the need to say this because folks, like most of my friends and yourself, always have to feel the need to say at some point. Well, we don't actually know these conversations ever happen. They're just imagining these things. And it's like, yeah. Hey, you know what else that applies to? Every single other thing you've ever seen that applies to a historical figure in a fictional movie. The only time they're actual quotes is if you've actually are redoing a speech given or something said in public. Other than that, of course, any conversation that happened behind the scenes, in the privacy of their homes, and is not going to be known. And even more so when it's the royal family who are, notorious for their tight-lippedness. At least there's, tape recorders somewhere in the White House taping people, apparently, Thanks, Tricky Dick. But, if you're going to have someone, try to imagine what would be said in the halls of royalty, it's going to be a guy like Peter Morgan. I think he's like the foremost writer of anything that's remotely royal related, in screenplay format. I mean, he had like The Last King of Scotland, The Queen. I mean, he got a story credit for Bohemian Rhapsody, which is about, Queen. So there you go.
Royalty of all types. Yeah, he certainly had a wide canvas here. I mean, 60 episodes, including this season. I mean, that's, what's that the equivalent of almost 60 hours? What would that be? 20 movies, 40 movies, something like that?
Something like that. Well,
Yeah.
it depends. He would be writing it, but he wouldn't be directing. So it depends who they got to direct him. If Nolan was directing it, then that would be, like 5 movies. Scorsese 3.5, but don't worry, you can watch it at home and make it into a miniseries. Anyway, like his last few movies.
Yeah.
Which is funny because it's kind of, they did something like that with this season. They actually, unlike the previous 5, they and oddly enough, maybe you could say they took a page from, it's almost like the AMC playbook where, the final season of Mad Men will be split up. This final season of Breaking Bad will be split up. They did similar to what Stranger Things did in its last season, where they gave us one part, and then like about a month later, they gave us the other part. And that's exactly what they did here. They gave us 4 episodes back in mid-November, and then they gave us the final 6 just last week. And when I saw that before I had seen the episodes, I saw what they were doing. It's like, oh, that's weird. They didn't make it even. And then you realize, once you watch the first 4, you're like, oh, okay, now I understand why they did it that way. I get it. So what we'll do, we'll take it in those 2 segments as well. We'll tackle the first half, or first 4, I guess, and then we'll tackle the final 6. Although that doesn't mean we're actually going to go through all 4 or all 6. In fact, there's no way in hell we're going to do that. But we'll cover everything that needs to be covered. So let's zip to the first part of the season. And we were talking before, and there was one episode that stood up before we got to the unfortunate events that we've been waiting for how they were going to handle for the last couple of years on this show. And that was the episode, Two Photographs. So, Kimber, why don't you start us off with your thoughts there, and we can move on from that.
Yeah, so this, like you said, the first four episodes, the first act of the last season, which is the Diana and Dodi Fayed story arc. Um, I really liked. If I had to pick something out of these first four episodes, the two photographs, episode two, which focused on the importance of image making within with the press and the royal family themselves, and they sort of centered it around these two characters. One who was very real, this photographer Mario Brenna, who was a real paparazzi photographer, who took famously, like the first photo of the kiss between Diana and Dodi Fayed, sold it for, I've seen estimates from anywhere from like $250,000 to, or £250,000 to £5 million, depending on where you read it. And then on the flip side, you've got this completely made up character, this Duncan Muir in his tweed jacket and button down Scottish tradition, who's like sort of the friend of the royal family and sort of, very dedicated to capturing their image in a very traditional way. And given, I was saying before, our background, we worked for a photography company, licensing company for years, and they had a paparazzi side of that business. And I liked the way they portrayed the sort of feeding frenzy of the paparazzi. In this, there's this quote from the character. The paparazzi says, like, we're hunters, we're killers, zipping around streets on motorbikes and renting boats and paying people off for tips. And even something I discovered when we were working for that company, that often celebrities worked in tandem with photo agencies to give them tips. So something looked like a photograph that was just sort of happened upon, but actually the photographers were being like tipped off to those events and where those celebrities might be. So sort of particularly with Diana, it's a, you know, the relationship of them working together, and then of course where we all know it's heading, that it ultimately is her undoing and death. And I just like that story with the photographers.
Yeah, what was interesting for me about that episode, obviously the contrast of the different photographers, the contrast of styles, but it's the old and the new,
Hmm.
and that pertains to everything we've seen with the royal family, because the monarchy, whatever is, as they get into even in later in the season, they still represent, the old, and the public's view, and which has become increasingly more negative over time. It's because, it's about modernization. And, so there's a big difference between like a photographer who, ha takes out has the old big camera. It's like Felix Unger, portraits a specialty, see the birdie, click, whatever. And the guy who roams around paying off people, getting on boats, hiding, whatever, the paparazzi. I mean, it's two very different styles, but and I just love how that's just a definite, clear parallel to what's been, baked into the storyline of The Crown, especially for the last couple seasons, as we've been seeing that, as opposed to like back in like the earlier seasons, when the royalty and the monarchy played a much bigger part in in British politics and whatever, and much less so as the seasons progress, as the years progress. Um,
Yeah, I think in the whole series too, I think the best episodes have been the ones that have done those sort of contrasting stories, like
mhm.
what the whether it's the old and the new, or the public and the private, like, but in big ways. And I think this one did a really good job at that. And there's going to be one that we talk about in the second half of this season, that does a similar sort of thing. I think
Right,
the
right,
same sort of themes.
right. I mean, when you move beyond that, I mean, basically you have in these four episodes overall, it's as you said, it's it's seeing Diana and Dodie together. We're seeing Charlie and Charles
Charlie.
being
That's
Charles.
King Charlie to you, sir.
Basically, my way of looking at the first 2.5 to 3 episodes, it's Diane and Dodie getting together, Charles being pissy and sad, Muhammad is awful. Oh God, there's so much paparazzi. Crash. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's how I pretty much sum up the
Mhm.
first three. See, all taken care of.
Yeah.
Which takes us to the fourth episode, which is Aftermath. And, in some ways, the title kind of says it all. This was actually how I anticipated they were going to start the season. I thought there was going to be more of a time jump, and they were going to avoid, any reenactment of Princess Diana's death. And I'll give them points for the creativity of hinting at the very start of the season with the man walking the dog in Paris, and we can't really see what's going on, but we know what's going on, with the cars whizzing by and the motorbikes, and then the off-screen crash, and then we eventually build back to that moment late in the third episode. So I had mentioned this to you before we started recording because, okay, clearly we have to talk about Aftermath and how they try to get a little creative on the show, doing things that they don't normally do. At least I don't recall them doing previous to this. And this is, and even though this is it's a device, because I'm not going to say trope, it's not a trope. It's a device that
Mhm.
we've all seen used on, especially in TV series over the years, where someone ends up speaking to, the person who has already passed away. They appear to them, as whether it's as their conscience, as a ghost, as just something they're imagining. They're just talking to them, and it almost wills them to life, so they're there talking to them, whatever. And that's what they do in this episode by having Diana pop up a couple times to talk to different characters. And I mostly like the device. I didn't love it. It depended on the scene and how much I believed it. Um, I might have found the actress who playing Diana more appealing in those scenes a little bit, but that might be just because of how they wrote the scenes of what she had to say. I think you're shaking your head, so I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion. Oh, it'd be kind of fun if you're the first negative person. Um, although the way I just did that little wrap up I might have sounded a little bit negative myself. I didn't mean to do that. Go ahead.
So I was like you were just saying that this is a device you've seen used before. Where do you think this has been used successfully? Because I was racking my brain after the fourth episode with the ghost of Diana talk and the ghost of Dodi Fayed talking to his father. Off the top of the dome, like where do you think that's been used effectively? Can you
Where
think of a show or something?
where someone's talking to someone who's already passed
Yeah,
away, and
yeah.
they did it a couple times on the show Scrubs. Um,
I
uh,
know they used it throughout 6 Feet Under.
yes, they did
The
use it on
father
6 Feet
would,
Under.
yeah, I thought that was very effective. But that show was all about death.
Let's see, they did it 2 times. They did it in 2 different times I know of on Scrubs. I think they might have done it on The West Wing, unless I'm confusing those two
Mm.
together. Yeah, I know what you're saying, but
I,
it depends how it's done. I mean,
yeah,
if I, if
yeah,
I, if I had planned this ahead of time, I could have broken
sure,
out a list.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Um, I I didn't like it. I mean, I liked the conversations. I liked her sitting with the Queen. I liked her sitting on the plane with Charles. I liked Dodie talking to his father. Like I liked the conversations, but man, it just like took me out of it. And I was like straight into like science fiction. Like I was just like, what is going on? Like the even though the show has played loose with historical facts at times, of course, like you said at the beginning of the show, it has to because it's a historical drama. It's not a documentary. But I felt this was like a bridge too far. Um, I also don't know, not a writer. I don't know how else you could have covered it. And maybe the I think he took a creative risk, and so I do give him credit for that. Um, I don't know how you could have covered it more conventionally. It probably would have been much more boring, like staring at TV coverage and newspapers and that kind of thing. Um, I did like what I really loved was when people were told about her death in the first few scenes of that, how they cut the sound out and it just went to these silent reactions. Um, I loved that choice. Not a fan of the Ghost of Diana and Dodi Fayed.
Okay. That's mostly, I would say it's a mostly valid way to look at it. Again, I don't, unless you're purporting to do something which is meant to be a gritty, grounded historical fact, pure whatever. I don't.
Hmm.
You can do whatever the hell you want as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if they could they go for me, could they have gone it? Could is it possible to go a step too far? Absolutely. I didn't feel that way because I did think about what are other ways they could have done this, and I thought, are we going to just have like little imagined flashback moments where there were conversations that happened once upon a time that never, which then we're getting to, okay, so we're just going to make up things even more than before.
Hmm.
But those moments wouldn't make any sense because that wasn't where they were in their lives at the time.
Hmm.
So the fact is, this is how I look at it. There are many people who've had people pass in their lives and whether it's either at home themselves or when they go to a graveside, people will say they talk to those that have passed. And they do sometimes can imagine a conversation, whatever, or just, they take it to, depicting it this way,
Hmm.
which this has been done in one way or another, since the dawn of fiction writing. I'm sure if I took the time to find
Sure.
a work by Shakespeare, I'm sure there's a ghost that talks to somebody. I know there's this Christmas Carol thing that involves a whole bunch of ghosts talking. So wait, so is Marley there or not? And so on and so forth. So I the reason why I liked it is because, all right, we're not pretending to be something that we're not. That's why I got annoyed. I got annoyed with people. The thing I said before. It's like, no, no, no. Now they're kind of embracing it here. They're doing that here. You know. So I have no problem. We didn't have a thing where like someone walked in the room and said, "Who are you talking to?" or any of that kind of stuff. So it,
Right.
it, it felt to me it was in these quiet moments these characters were have no one around. It Diana was representing their conscience,
Hmm.
and that's why. And they do something in a different way later in the season, which I also think
Hmm.
works really well. And probably, I'm going to guess you probably have a more positive feeling about, if only because of who they are.
Yeah.
So for me, wow, I can't believe I'm the positive one.
Yeah. Yeah,
For me, it
we'll get
worked.
to that, and you're right. I mean, you're right in jumping ahead and guessing. I do have a a nuanced, like, better reaction to the final episode of the season,
Right.
which uses a similar sort of mechanic.
So overall, it was funny because when they put up these four, and for me, to a certain extent, the first three kind of blend together. It was just like one really long episode. I mean, the stuff with the two
Yeah.
photographers at least made that creatively a more interesting episode because it changed the formatting of the episode
Yes.
and did it in a way that they've done things similar to that before, and they'll do it one more time later on. And Aftermath was, I guess why I liked the episode overall. I gotta say I loved it. It wasn't like my top 10 favorite Crown episodes, although I don't know if I have 10. I was like, okay, how are they going to deal with this? We've been waiting for this. This is the thing, let's face it. We've been waiting how they're going to deal with Princess Diana's death and how we're going to get there and how we're going to see those reactions. What's the Queen's reaction actually going to be? How they're going to depict Charles in
Hmm.
the opening moments and later on, and how are the kids going to be? And I agree. I also like those moments of silence, which I thought it was The writer, I'm assuming Peter Morgan wrote the episode. I don't have it in front of me, but he probably did. He either wrote it or at the very least co-wrote it.
Hmm.
Um, in a way, it was kind of showing a little bit of respect by not having a pure entire reenactment of that and how
Hmm.
they would have reacted. It's like, we're going to take a step back here. We don't, you know, they're going to be feeling shock and grief. Well, we're not going to push your face in it. And by the same token, we know that these people, they're either watching the show themselves or they're being told about it.
Hmm.
So we're not going to put their faces in it as well, especially because now we're dealing with the subject matter everyone was worried about since the show started. Like, you know, when back in season 1, like, you know, so at some point they're going to have to get the Princess Diana, right? That's gonna, how they going to
Right.
deal with that?
Well, that's why I loved that because that was the big question of this season. How are they going to, and like you said, of the whole show, perhaps, because that's many of our like most recent memory of this, or our adult memory or whatever, you know. And I love that opening scene of the guy out walking his dog in Paris. Like they just started with that.
Right,
Like, let's just get it out of the way. We're just going to start with the car crash, and then we're just going to like back the story into it and get there again by the end of these 4 episodes. I thought that was super smart writing and almost like sort of took some of the pressure off the storytelling of the first 4 episodes,
right,
because it's just like, let's deal with like the elephant in the room and or the gun on the table or whatever the, the symbolism might be. And I thought that was really smart.
right. And I won't be specific about what show I'm referencing, so don't guess it, please. Because I know I have friends who haven't seen it yet, and I know they eventually will, and I don't necessarily want to spoil something.
Mm-hmm.
But it was nice to see a Netflix series that opens with something that hints at some form of a car crash, and then we build up to it later on, and it actually means something. It's actually important, although we know what it is in this one. On another Netflix series where we see a car crash, it opens the season, then we get to it many episodes later, and it means absolutely nothing. It was like the writer
Oh,
should
that's
have been
good. I have
taken out of
no
the
idea
show.
what you're talking about, so I can't even
Good.
spoil it. So that's great.
The people who know. The people who don't, private message me. I'll tell you. Anyway,
All right,
so
so let's get on to
let's
the
get to
other 60% of the season.
exactly. And look, the other 60% of the season is basically, it's interesting how it kind of, the series focus had shifted away from the Queen and Philip after the first 3 to 4 seasons, and then we transition to Charles and Diana, and it's interesting how we get to these final 6. How we say, "Oh, look, now they're shifting to William." So it seems like this. If I'm going to be cruel about it, and I shouldn't be, but I will. Um, with episode accepted, for a minute there, it seemed like this final act of the series was going to toggle between, hey, here's William at school, and now somebody dies. Here's William at school, and then somebody dies.
An old person dies.
Yes. Well, look, there was a certain point where I was concerned, not concerned. I was like going, wait a minute. I was looking at how many episodes were left. I was like, okay, are we just gonna have a succession of let's continue just to watch the older elderly members of the royal family die episode after episode after episode?
Hmm.
I'm glad that they didn't completely go that way. There were 2 episodes in a row. I thought, oh wait, are they really doing that? But I think they handled that situation. I will give them a lot of credit for doing it in a way I hadn't anticipated. And I always like when writers and creators come up with something that wasn't the way I expected. And I think generally speaking, it works.
Yeah.
But let's go earlier in the season, to one specific episode. I'm guessing it was the 6th episode, overall of the season, Ruritania.
Yeah, Ruritania. Yeah, I think again, this is like 2 photographs to me. It steps outside of the this season in particular is a very small narrative. It's about interpersonal relationships among a handful of people. It doesn't look at the world at large or bring in other characters. And I really love this Tony Blair, this Tony Blair versus the Queen episode. I love the depiction of Tony Blair, like that little domestic scene of like him and his wife, like making fun of like Bill Clinton's accent, like after he's gotten off the phone with him. I think that's just hilarious, like little thing like that a husband and wife might do. Um, and this whole thing again, like Two Photographs, Blair is advocating for a reformation of the tradition of the royal family and all the trappings around it. Um, and it seems as though they're willing to consider it for a moment, but then it comes all the way around. And again, like has been covered in this entire show over 60 episodes, that they keep coming back to the royal family does have a purpose in the tradition. There's a reason why they keep coming back to what a lot of people might deem as nonsense and expensive and useless in a modern world and so on. But I thought this episode was great performance by um, Blair and the Queen. I love the Women's Institute relationship that the Queen has, and then Blair completely botches, doesn't read the room with his speech. Um, and the whole bit where they're reviewing this hilarious, like, person after person, like the Swan's Guard and the guy that folds the napkins, and like it is just the absolute most ridiculous part of royalty, but the show winds up pointing out why it makes sense to the royals, and I think it's super smart episode.
Absolutely. What's interesting for me was when you go to the earlier seasons of the series, um, oftentimes the most memorable or best scenes and episodes overall would be anything and everything depicting the relationship between the current queen and whoever the prime minister was. I
Hmm.
mean, we'll probably have a minor chat later on about the different performers who played either be Queen Elizabeth or Prince Philip and so on and so forth. But perhaps just as maybe even more significantly, we also have all these different prime ministers that we've seen over the course of time. A few kind of maybe flitter away to memory, but Lithgow opening up as Churchill,
Hmm.
that was what attracted us to the series in the first place, and those scenes
Hmm.
between him and Claire Foy and how much importance was played between them. Then you had like them, like when we talked about like the Thatcher. So you had like Gillian Anderson going up against Olivia Colman, and those are like really great scenes between them. And we either someone really loved Gillian Anderson in that role or didn't, it was a little bit of polarization there, and
Hmm.
understandably, I get why there was. I actually enjoyed Johnny Lee Majors. Johnny Lee. Wait, what's his last name? The,
Um,
the
yeah, I can't remember.
Miller, Johnny Lee Miller playing John Major,
Yep.
who I always thought was a comparatively inconsequential, only compared to those who came before and after him,
Hmm.
prime minister, because Thatcher was such a huge figure and Blair became a huge political figure, after Major. Um, it was funny because when I knew they were going to get to Tony Blair, I was like, "Oh, are they going to have Tony Blair here, and they're not going to have Michael Sheen play him? Because
He always
every other
breaks him.
time, Michael Sheen plays Tony Blair. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's played Tony Blair on at least one, if not two different times for a Peter Morgan production, if I'm not mistaken. And if I'm wrong, who cares?
He
He
must have
still
been
made a good
busy.
joke. But instead, it's like I think the guy's name is like Bertie Carvel. I think is the actor's name.
Yeah, he's
Uh,
mostly a stage actor. He hasn't done much on TV or in the movies.
well, and maybe it's because I'm so used to the Michael Sheen version. um, I really liked the way he took to the role, and there was both a calculated but an earnest quality at the same time, operating at the same time. Whenever he had his scenes, especially with the Queen, and we got to see that kind of taken down a little bit in the scenes with his wife, as you described. Kind of also surprised that they decided not to do any actual depictions of either of the presidents in these final 10. I guess they just didn't want to be bothered with it. Only because they did go through the trouble with, with Kennedy and with Johnson. And I guess they avoided Nixon entirely, when I think
Hmm.
about it. Um, but I, I was looking forward to the whole, the scenes where you have the queen sitting there and the prime minister has to come in and tolerate her, or she has to tolerate him, and or her in Thatcher's case. Because I think that when I look back at the entire series, those are my favorite things about the series overall, just as far as just interactions, more so than between members of the royal family. So this I thought was like kind of a return to that. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, okay. And I can see how that would be it's more difficult to get to that in these later seasons because they're just not the players that they were back in the 50s and early 60s. And that's why so much of the focus shifts to, the children and Charles and whatever. And it becomes a bit more melodramatic, gossipy, historic information that we're all somewhat aware of at a certain age, as opposed to what we were watching back in those first couple of seasons, where unless you're a history buff, you didn't know what impact the royal family might have had on any kind of political dealings back in the 50s and things like that.
Hmm.
So I really did enjoy it a lot. I love, like you, I love the parade of the different, you know, seemingly silly positions that the royal family has, and how they all kind of showed why they exist. Especially, was it the Master of Swans? I love the Master.
Yeah, whatever he was. Yeah, yeah. And they were all just like also proud of their jobs, and yeah, it was wonderful, and it was so strange and odd, and each one was like a superhero. They had their own costume and mannerisms and so on. So yeah, I loved that.
And what was fascinating about it is we're watching and we're hearing what each of these positions were. And there's a few in a row where one might be inclined to roll their eyes like, really? And that's still a thing, especially when it's something that's been handed down from generation to generation kind of a position. But there's a certain seriousness that and respect are even given by the queen and her assistant right hand man there the
Hmm.
whole time, where they're not viewing them in a comical way, the way that we might be, and they're
Right,
taking it seriously, and overall and that's where the moral of the story is how this is all here for a reason. As
right,
and yes, you can mock it, but it's there for a reason. It's almost like a shield in a way.
right.
Um, and
It
then
also brought her character down to a level that she had never really paid attention to. And maybe this is something that comes with age and so on. Like she had never really considered that all those years she had gone to those dinners that there was a guy in charge of the napkins.
right,
She had never, and once she bonded in whatever way with those individuals, she actually had an appreciation for them in their particular skills and traditions that sort of stacked up and added, like, oh, these are the people that basically build the traditions behind me, and and sort of buffet our entire royal family up. And so I felt like she, in the same way that she has this relationship with this women's institute organization, which is not royal in any way. It's just a bunch of rural housewives and very traditional conservative organization. Same way she had this relationship with those people, she discovered this invisible relationship she had with all these other people working around her entire life.
right. It's at long last, it's the understanding that it's not simply the royal family. It's these
Mm,
different components that are a part of the overall support system, and there are any number of people who do still hold them in high regard, and whether it be the women's organization who, obviously are fervent supporters of the queen and the royal family, or all these different positions who I forgot about the napkin dude. That was great. Uh, Lord of the napkins. Anyway, yeah, but they all have their part to play and they're part of it, and it is why it works. Even if at this point it's more about pomp and circumstance and not and less about political power, but they represent something, and that's what she. I think that's what it's like the thing that happened in a previous season where it was about the ship. Remember this
Yeah, the
whole
yacht
the whole thing
that
about
they wanted to decommission.
decommission it, right?
Yeah,
And what that actually represented and so on.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
that's me.
Right.
So we go from an episode like that. Now, I think it seems like every season, or it seems like every season, there is at least one episode that suddenly really focuses on Princess Margaret.
Mm-hmm.
We can remember where we either was back in the days of Vanessa Kirby or Helena Bonham Carter, and we've been watching Leslie Manville, and that role has been somewhat diminished as we've
Mm-hmm.
moved through the years because it just because other players are taking center stage now, like Charles, Diana, etc. But we finally get that episode with Princess Margaret, and oh Lord, it's the episode Ritz. It it's just a sad episode that just keeps getting sadder as far as the modern day story, and it
Mm-hmm.
tells us, and then it does that nice little parallel of something that happened back on VE Day, with the Royal Sisters. And hey, if you're gonna point to something that most likely probably didn't happen, I'm gonna go with that, unless you know something I don't and did some research that I'm not aware
So,
of.
so this did happen.
Really?
It didn't happen as depicted by many different accounts. Uh, the Elizabeth and her sister did go outside the palace somewhat in disguise on VE Day, and it's hard for us to understand how what a big deal VE Day was in Europe and England and around the world at that moment.
Hmm.
But they had a larger guard with them. They had a governess with them. They were in disguise. Um, they may or may not have gone to the Ritz. The thing that probably bugged me the most about this is that they pushed it. By some accounts, they went outside the palace and they participated in like a conga line with some like commoners and so on. Whether or not they got to the Ritz, I've read varying accounts about. But the thing that really bothered me was
Hmm.
I felt that Morgan went too far in the writing, that she had to look down this set of stairs, and there were a bunch of, as they said, there's Harlem music down there, there's black soldiers. Like they had to try to make this, like they used that as like a dumb stand in for like how edgy could we make this experience. And I was really, it's probably one of the most troubling things of the entire series for me that they used these African American soldiers as a stand-in for Elizabeth's rebellion. And certainly we see that in some other historical things covered in previous episodes when she dances with, oh God, I can't remember. He's an African king or prime minister in one of their colonies when she goes to visit, and it caused a big scandal. That really happened. There was a photograph of that, like at a reception or something like that. But I felt like this, as a totally made up thing, was just like narratively a really uncomfortable, like just a bit too far.
Hmm. Um. Okay. Let's see. I'm not going to say I'm not going to say I disagree with you per se because it certainly stood out that way, and I was especially when that scene starts. And I sensed where they were gonna go. I was like, okay, let's see what they're doing here. Because I'm already at this point, I'm already like, okay, I'm pretty sure this didn't happen, but let's see because it's got the whole. It's been a secret that's been kept for the last 45, 50 years between sisters, and Margaret keeps seeming like she's about to fucking let it go, and you know, at a
Yeah.
birthday party or whatever. Um, so I agree about the cringe factor and like going, oh, if the way you got it, and I mean, it's a tough line to draw because on one hand, I get wanting to show it's the Americans. And, at that time, and it's not, the
Bunch of
more,
guys from Brooklyn.
yeah. But because it was just, you want it to be jazz, you want it to be something just like unstructured, and
Mhm.
people dressed as a certain way on stage, and just kind of going crazy with it, whatever. Um, but but the thing, using the black soldiers that way initially kind of made me kind of go, but I was very torn on it because there was part of me that said, okay, if there's a few guys and they're not all black, this might not have quite that kind of feeling. But then I went, yeah, but how likely was that at that time? I don't, I might not, I mean, we could get away with it because maybe if it's like three guys and if just one of them wasn't, maybe it doesn't have quite that kind of, ooh, enticement, ooh, and it's like, ooh, look what we're doing. And it's like, you're making me really go. So her big thing was that she hung out with a black dude. Is that what you're going to say? Which isn't what happened. But, it, I wonder how necessary it was at all.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, is, is, is the juice worth the squeeze, as they say,
Hmm.
I'm not going to say, I can't claim that I found it offensive, but it could have been. It came, but I'm also wary of saying it that way because then I don't want to come off not how I mean to critique
Yeah.
it. It just, part of me also didn't really buy it.
Yeah. I don't. I waver between being offended by it and just feeling it was like super lazy writing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
that's what
I usually,
I think it was just lazy. Like, what can I plug in here to make this scene seem super rebellious and super scandalous that it would be a secret between sisters for 50 years? Oh, and it's because it's a bunch of black guys.
yeah,
Like that, like that's like, oh God, really?
I tend to hate the terms like lazy writing. I'm always quick to push back on that. It's like people
Yeah.
say filler for an episode or something, which also drives me crazy. Or people will complain about fan service, which also drives me crazy.
Yeah, that
I
drives me
think
crazy.
all those people need to shut the fuck up. But I can't
I love fan
disagree.
service.
Most things we watch, the nature of the production is servicing fans. So stop
Right.
complaining about something that's
Otherwise,
fan
why am I
service.
watching it
Yeah. Oh no,
if you're not serving me?
a superhero or a sci-fi fantasy movie. Oh, there's some fans. I'm like, why are we watching it?
Yeah, that's why I paid money to watch this because I want to be served.
Never understood that.
Yeah,
It,
whatever.
it, idiot comments. Um,
Tangent.
I almost wish they'd done something that had just a bit more subtlety, and
Hmm.
may have still had the same kind of, this has been a secret between us for the last 50 years. And I think this is where I agree. Actually, I do agree with you, generally speaking. Like, okay, let's just do this because then it's a really easy, okay, no, we get it. Oh, whatever. It's like, no, I would have rather you just done, you're going to be making something up no matter what, you
Hmm.
know? So make up something that it could have been just one random dude that she ended up dancing with, and maybe they had which would have been a bigger deal because she's, she's, she's Elizabeth.
Hmm.
You can't do that with her. And,
Hmm.
and you never told Philip, oh, there was this one night, this one man I shared a chast kiss with, whatever.
Hmm.
Could have Pride and Prejudice the whole damn thing. But I mean, look,
Whatever.
it
I think they also needed to contrast it with, I mean, this episode is really, I mean, it's bringing the Margaret arc, like you said, it's the bringing the Margaret arc to the end,
yeah.
and it's so sad. Like her strokes and the scalding in the bathtub,
Oh yeah.
and she keeps trying to like put on a proper face and keep going to parties and smoke when she's not supposed to be and drink when she's not supposed to be. And I mean, she was always, as depicted in the show, like the central sort of party girl opposite of her sister. And I think this was the reminiscence because this was the one time that Margaret saw her sister act like she did.
Right. The one
you
time
know,
Elizabeth was the wild one, not
and not
Martha
me.
Meaver.
Yeah,
Right.
and
That, that
so
that's
and
why I'm
this
willing to
it
forgive it. That's why I'm
yeah,
willing
and
to forgive
that's
it. I wish it
yeah,
hadn't been, but
right,
if it had been used in any other type of episode, it would have just made me furious.
right.
Here, okay, I get why we're doing it. I get the contrast, and this is the thing they share, and it adds a level of pathos to her passing,
Mhm.
and this one little secret they kept their lives, whatever. It's like, okay, that works. Oh, by the way, I haven't mentioned yet, just but I want to give Imelda Staunton, a lot of credit in these final episodes of the series because she didn't have quite up until we get to these later episodes. She didn't quite have the showy material and the major material that certainly that Claire Foy had, and even Olivia Colman had up to a certain point.
Mhm.
But in these later episodes, I thought she did a remarkable job. They actually gave her some really solid material in a few of these episodes. So I really wanted to. I think people sometimes we never give her the credit that we give the actresses. We always go, oh, Olivia Colman, she's amazing. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
amazing. But Staunton, she deserves a little credit, especially and particularly in this episode. I think there's a lot of moments with her that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, well, I think as these final six episodes, like you said, like, it's a lot of people die. It's a lot of the old people dying.
Yep.
And there's a lot of stuff around memory and perspective. Like, in the first episode when Philip goes to visit William at school and like they're looking at the posters of like Claudia Schiffer in William's room, and so I was like, oh, in my day it was Greta Garbo on the wall and not this Claudia Schiffer. Like they're all giving these and like in some of the other episodes where Philip is like looking at old photographs and home movies, and the Queen is doing the same thing. She's looking at home movies. There's a lot of reminiscence particularly in the last six episodes of this season, and they do it in different ways. And sometimes it's just through people talking about memories. Sometimes it's the films on the wall that they're showing. Sometimes it's these recreated flashbacks, like on VE Day. So I do appreciate how he's trying to capture what's on the mind of this sort of like dying off generation. And Margaret's remembrances of her wild days and still trying to live them out like she was in her 20s, even though she's had strokes and shouldn't be partying anymore.
Right. 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 And no, also, yeah, Jonathan Pryce has a few really nice scenes in this season as well. Especially when he goes to see William, he has that conversation across the table from him, and I thought it was remarkably well written. And I believe the women he talks about who are on his wall, my memory is, I think it was Betty Grable and Rita Hayworth.
Oh,
Sometimes
yeah, there you go. Yeah, my day it was Betty
I
Grable.
remember going Betty Grable. He went with Betty Grable. That's an interesting
Yeah.
one. Okay.
And again,
Um,
just to touch on it, move on. I love the scene when he's talking to William over the chess board, and like it's so well written. I think it's complete bullshit. I don't think any conversation like that ever happened between Prince Philip and his grandson, or any grandfather and their grandson in the history of the world.
all
And
right, Kim. Jesus Christ. I'm
let's
gonna
move on.
revoke your membership from the podcast.
Okay, sleep, dearie, sleep.
Anyway, here we go. Now he's not gonna like this one either. I don't get why is she out of focus? Is she a ghost? Is she under bubble wrap? I, I didn't know we became the series TV drama literal only podcast.
It says drama in the title.
Drama, which means you're dramatizing something. Jesus.
But yet you say it's serious. So
Yeah, well, you're taking it too serious. Anyway, great scene. Don't listen to him, people. Anyway, so yes, sleep, dearie, sleep. And by the time we get to this last episode, and as you just mentioned, there's a certain point when we're watching these final six, and I had to thought, wait, we're not just going to be watching, episode after episode of each, of member of the royal family passing away, because I was doing the calculation, like, okay, so we need like, so we had to have that, then we have to have a Philip dying episode, and we have to have a Queen dying episode, and we're going into the last episode, and we're like, okay, they're not going to do a whole bunch of time jumping here. And they come up with a really uh, nicely nuanced, creative way to handle it. And it's having the queen help to plan and prepare her own funeral, which really gives us the chance to watch the queen consider and consider her own mortality. And it's it is the looking back and memories, of course, whatever. But the it's the perfect way to get when we get to the final episode of this entire series. It's like, well, this is the culmination of it because at the end of the day, she's the focus. She's the one wearing that crown. And the fact that this had not really been something that had been done before, that the queen, or whoever was, the person on the throne would be planning their own, well, how their death was going to be handled, kind of makes it a unique situation. Now, I don't know if that actually happened. I'm willing to say it probably something like this did. That would make a lot of sense to me that they would have done some level of prep, especially, because she dies like maybe 10 years later than this, because she died in her 90s, right?
She just died uh
She died
year
in
before
21.
last.
She died in
I th
21 or the
Was it
22.
21?
I think it was 21 or
Was that
22.
long ago?
Oh
Yeah, I
wait,
think
wait, what? Well,
this is taking
She
place.
and Philip died within a year of each other. I think. I don't remember if he was
Yeah,
21. She might have. It could have been 22 with her. It might have been 22. I don't. You know
whatever.
what? I don't want to get
It's
hung
less
up.
than 20
I don't
years
care.
later.
I don't care.
Yeah,
It's on the show, so
yeah,
I don't care.
yeah.
Um, I don't need to be right because it's not on the show. I
Right,
don't
and
care.
that's not the point, and that's
But this is
certainly
10.
not the point of the episode.
But this is over 10 years earlier. Because I
Yeah.
think we're roughly around 2010 here. I think because I think that's when Charles and Camilla got married. I think it was roughly like around 2010, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
Um, but by having the idea of her, confronting her own mortality, and it gives us this great succession of moments where she's. Oh, I used Succession twice in one thing. I must want to watch Succession.
Yeah, there you go.
Um,
I should watch that show someday.
see,
Yeah, I know it.
you say
Why do
all
you? I'm a
you, s-
Philistine.
you say all the other piffle, and then it turns out you never watched it. Next thing you know, like Breaking what? I don't know. Breaking Sad. I've never seen that either. Um, let's just fast forward right to breaking out the great performers who played Elizabeth before and getting to use them in the series, and not just in the little clips that we are watching on the home movie footage where like, oh, there's Matt Smith, whatever. It's like, oh, maybe I should give him another chance because I remember I hated him as Philip, whatever, or you see the photos of, Claire Foy, whatever. The fact that he actually got to be used in this way, I enjoyed it. I thought it worked. And maybe it's also because, you know what? The fact that I got to see Claire Foy play Elizabeth again, the fact that I got to see Olivia Colman play Elizabeth one more time and have a conversation quite unlike any kind of conversations they would have had in the past. And even if they conflicted with each other, which I like that too, because they show Elizabeth at different stages of her life and how their perspective would be, the Elizabeth of the late 40s, 50s is not going to be the same one as the late 60s, 70s. And I really
Mm.
kind of enjoyed the way they handled those scenes. And and if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Staun ever makes eye contact with them. I don't recall she ever does. If she does, I just don't.
Oh, that's a good point. I think they're always like over her maybe with Olivia Colman. Maybe not. No, that's really interesting. I should
She's always
probably watch that.
behind her. She's always busy doing something else.
Yeah, yeah,
It's, I don't, I think that, I don't think they ever share the same plane exactly.
yeah. So it's a good point. Like I think the the two main questions of this season were what were they going to do with Diana's death? How are they going to do that? And where were they going to end it? Right. And they begin it in a really interesting way in that opening shot of the guy walking his dog in Paris and the car crash, sort of abstractly. And they end it by showing the Queen's funeral without it really showing her death.
Right.
Through the planning, through when she's walking through the church and she's imagining like walking by her own coffin draped, in the flag, through the, like you said, the conversations with her younger self. Um, I have known several, not, obviously non-royal people who have planned their own funerals extensively. Um, and then I've attended those funerals. Like I actually had a guy who was 20 years older than me that passed away a few years ago. But like he actually showed me like his book with his funeral in it, like with the music and like everything in it. So this is not so odd, and it's probably not so odd for royalty in particular. Um, so I thought it was really smart. Unlike the Diana ghost thing, where, like you bring up, she was sitting next to people and making eye contact with them in conversation. I did like the subtlety almost of her younger selves being to the side behind her, sort of recognizing that space. This is my past. This is my present.
Right. Exactly.
Um, in that consideration of it.
And also it becomes a more, I could see it being more acceptable to you because we talk to ourselves. We
Right.
all do. I
Yes.
talk to myself excessively
Yes.
for me.
Right.
And but I never, although I might talk to myself quite a bit, I never imagine that I'm looking at myself, talking to myself, unless I'm doing and it's like it's a movie cliche actually, unless I'm actually talking in the mirror, which I try not to do because, I'm not, Snow White or something. Um, so, but I like, because it made sense that it is, it's obviously a lot of it is guilt and conscience and regret and how you're dealing with things. But I like that's how they handle that, but that's how it's, because the thing with the Queen for all these seasons, and just she's probably the most famous yet inscrutable historic figure of the last 100 years, if you think about it, because there's so much that we can never know about her,
Hmm.
which is why so much of the series is obviously imagined, which is why I go, yeah, obviously, shh, stop.
Sure. Right.
It's not, he's like, oh, I bet Lincoln didn't have that kind of, well, I don't know. They didn't keep track of what Lincoln said back then either. Um, but
Well, it was Daniel Day-Lewis, so.
yeah, but we'll forgive it because, yeah. But here, I really, that long walk down, I guess it's the church at the end, right?
Hmm.
And someone, I realized, oh, this is the final shot. Okay. I'll have to give them credit because there was something I was expecting them to do, and they didn't do it. And I said, you know what? I respect them not doing it because if you really think about it, you don't need to. It's recent. They're not making this series with the idea someone's going to watch it 100 years from now and
Hmm.
wonder what happened. No postscripts.
Hmm.
They did give us a postscript with Margaret because that's something that maybe we didn't quite remember, that she had passed, just a couple months later.
Hmm.
But we don't get a postscript telling us that, you know, a rundown of when Philip died or when she actually died or that Charles took
When Charles
whatever.
became king and when Kate and Wills had a baby,
Right.
and
I think
yeah.
they just decided, you know what? Not necessarily. What we did in this episode tells the story that we wanted to tell. And
Right.
this is, because at this point, she's nearing her end. We don't need to show you any, furtherance into decrepitude that might have
Hmm.
happened, years later, whatever.
Right.
So
Right.
I thought it was kind of almost a triumphant way to handle, the close of that character and the series. So I was really kind of impressed by the way they ended
Yeah.
the series overall, because that was the big question mark. Where are they going to stop? I would not have guessed this would have been the moment, but they came up with something. I was like, okay, that works. Yeah. I didn't realize, by the way, speaking of the final episode, because the other thing that happens during this whole episode is the preparation of, the marriage between Charles and Camilla. I didn't realize the entire time I'm watching this season that it was the actress Olivia Williams playing Camilla at this point. I mean, where I'm sitting right now, as I speak to you on this podcast, there's a giant Rushmore poster behind me. And one of the people in that poster, one of the stars of that movie, is Olivia Williams.
Hmm.
And I never put it together. Like, wait, I didn't know until I was like jotting down some of the names of the actors playing the different parts. And I went, wait, that was Olivia Williams?
Yeah,
Holy crap! I had no
his
idea.
teacher, right?
Yes, exactly. She was a teacher, and she's
Yeah.
also the wife in The Sixth Sense. So two made.
Oh, I didn't remember that, but
Well, now you
yeah,
do.
yeah, it's the final episode is the longest episode
Yep.
of any of them. And I always think like, when you see those edits and it's like, oh, this episode's 49 minutes and this one's 53 minutes, like each week, like God, like why can't somebody cut an episode the same length every week or whatever? But this almost seems intentional. Like in that final shot, like I didn't think about what they might do extra with it, but I watched that final shot of her, this tiny little woman walking through this enormous space as like a mortal walking through this huge tradition, into the future and, eventually her own death. And I thought it was really smart. Like for a season that I had a lot of problems with in that, I start thinking about the whole series. Where I loved the series the most is when it was big, when Claire Foy was buzzing around the world to the different, colonies and learning about being somebody on a world stage and the importance of herself, or when Margaret was going to the White House, or when there were big events and disasters and world events and so on. Like when the show was big, those were my favorite parts. My knock on this season is that it got so small. It got to be just about Dodie and Diana and Charles, and then just about Will and Kate. And it's interesting that in our conversation, you and I didn't talk at all about Will and Kate
Hmm.
because obviously I could care less about that story arc. And I know it's important because, of the eventual secession of, the royal family and so on. But like that just and I liked the three characters that they cast in that arc, are relative like unknowns and they're not experienced in any way. Like it's kind of interesting casting, but like I really don't care about that story at all. I liked the show when it was big. Um,
Well,
and I felt at the end it showed the bigness of Elizabeth exiting through the church in the smallness of her against the tradition.
right, right. Well, as I think I referenced it earlier in the podcast. I mean that's probably what I think I used the phrase something that's baked into the series, right? Unfortunately, one of the things that's baked into the series is the gradual and then quick diminishing of the importance of the British Royal Empire in over the last 75 years, and as it only could be. So you go from a story which is the macro, and how a major world figure and played such a major part in British politics, in their dealings with the prime minister and society throughout the years of when Claire Foy is Elizabeth, and even to a certain extent certainly when Olivia Colman is, certainly during the 60s,
Hmm.
if not as much once we get into the 70s and later. Um, and then we go from macro to micro, where all of a sudden and I thought that was one of the problems with the series. If I was going to be a little negative about it, and I will be a little negative about it, because I noticed that like seasons 3 and 4 made my best of lists the years that they were on. I think season 3 was like number 8 on my list of 2019, and season 4 was number 8 on my list for 2020. Season 5 wasn't mentioned. It didn't make my,
Yeah,
and I'll tell you right now, this one's probably unlikely to make my list either. Especially, I
yeah,
haven't made it yet, but in my mind, it's like, well, I can already think of 10 shows that are better than that. And
yeah.
it's
I would agree. Since season 4, that's when it's. I mean, season 4 is when it started focusing on
the shift.
the Diana Charles, and then their.
Right. Which we knew, but the thing is, we knew that was going to be the case.
Mhm.
I mean, there was nothing surprising about that. And, and I was concerned, remember thinking, I had a level of concern for the series because, okay, as I said before, we're going to eventually start moving away from, you know, things that were more important as far as world history or even British history and how it affected politics and society and whatever. And we're going to get more into the more sordid side because it's going to be more the fodder of tabloids with, Charles and Diana. And it's going to be that. And even at least there was still interest to be held there because it's still kind of a painful story, especially when you know about, the torturous, feelings and situations that Diana went through, whatever. But I was still aware, like, okay, but eventually the Queen and Philip, they're going to be receding more into the background of the series because there's not really going to be that much for them to be doing. They just
Mhm.
simply didn't do as much as they got into their older years. I mean, if they had, for whatever reason, either suddenly had passed away or decided to, step away from the throne and someone like Charles had taken over, decades earlier, then maybe the royal family has a different place in society. But due to those scandals, due to that situation with Diana, due to the divorce and everything else, there was no way that was ever going to happen. So the Queen clutched her hands on that throne for, well, pretty much longer than any other monarch, and other than, was it Victoria, they said, was the only other one that stayed that long? I think they say it in one of the
It would
episodes.
be Victoria if it was anybody. Yeah.
By the way, there was something to be said, that episode where everybody thinks she's about to step down and,
Again,
and she doesn't. Was kind of, I found that very entertaining.
yeah, entertaining, but again, probably absolute nonsense from what I've read. That
Okay.
it's the way in which she's ordained from God and so on, that she would have never considered that. It's just not the way. I mean, what her father did was for a very specific reason, which sort of starts the show in some ways, because he abdicates in order to marry, an American. Um, but yeah, I think it's complete like hogwash as she was considering that. She just like scratched it out.
Well, I,
Great,
I don't, okay.
great drama.
I don't claim to be I don't claim and nor do I plan to be an expert on royal history. So I don't know, if one goes back over the last 200 or 300 years, if every person who sat on the throne waited till they pretty much died and then
Pretty
someone took over
much.
for them. I don't know if that's how it happened.
You do it.
Maybe they all died younger, but you also, but then again, you didn't have people living into their 70s and hitting their
Right.
80s
Well, that
where there would
that
be a
was the
concern
thing.
that someone in her condition, her situation,
Right.
might not be physically capable of doing
Right.
the things.
Yeah.
And so that's why I would give it, enough plausibility that it didn't phase me at all. But as we already said, I keep saying it's, it's a work of fiction. So,
Yeah. I will say through this conversation over the last number of minutes here, I've got a better appreciation for this season in how it wrapped things up. Even though I had problems with, once things shifted in seasons 5 to the Diana Fayed Charles drama, and the first 4 episodes of this season, I found that to be the least interesting, but I don't think you could have stopped it at season 4. You had to get all the way here.
no, exactly.
You had to
It's
show.
unfortunate, but you had
You
to
had
do
to
it.
get there. Yeah. And
And the only way, here's the thing, Kimber, at least for, one of the areas we do pretty much agree on is how much more we appreciate the earlier seasons and, the bigness of the story and the moments and the episodes. And I mean, keep in mind, you also got that's when Elizabeth was a truly titanic figure. That's the era when you have a Winston Churchill and then
Hmm.
people like that, or you had a few really amazing standout episodes that we can look back on right now, and off the top of it, like, okay, that's clearly the best one of the series, and so on and so forth, and whatever. And you knew you were not gonna have that as we get later,
Hmm.
unless you start just purely making shit up. And putting aside the fact, as I've already said a number of times, well, keep in mind, 98% of everything you're watching technically falls under the making shit up category. That's why I find it a kind of a specious argument. It's like, well, other than the actual speeches she gave on that were broadcast, whatever, which wasn't all that often, everything else is made up to
Yeah.
one extent or another. You know, I think in my opinion, I think most of it's like, okay, I'm fine with that because that actually applies to everything I've ever watched ever that involves historic figures. Um, except when I think maybe, oh, I'm just, I'm not buying this. Like I could buy that she was at least considering it, although clearly she wasn't going to. By the way, the thing that we could skip over is the Queen being that funny in person is not something she was typically known for, although there were other occasions, because you and I, working in as you mentioned earlier, the photo industry, there's that photo I remember, of an occasion where she's standing there doing a speech, and it might be, it's one of the Bushes. I don't remember if it's George Bush or George W. Bush, and they're on like the dais and they're
Oh yeah,
cracking up
yeah,
next, and it's
yeah.
clearly from a joke that she just dropped. So she could drop the occasional joke, although we hadn't really seen that on the series.
Right.
I don't count the talking to the women's initiative, whatever, because that was, silliness, whatever. But the jokes she was dropping here were like, oh wow,
Yeah.
did she get Jeff Ross to write her materials? It's like
Yeah, but I
was
mean,
she
by all accounts, like of the little that I've read about this, she actually was fairly like witty and funny and dry, like with her humor in her own way, and could surprise people. Even though, you know,
Right, but we just didn't get to see that much when
yeah,
they're doing public speeches because they always
yeah,
be like, you
yeah,
can't be that way, whatever,
yeah, yeah,
and
it's true.
everything has to be very formal and dignified and whatever. And I like that she wasn't there, but I just thought that really worked because obviously we know going into it, well, we know that didn't happen because it didn't.
Hmm.
We already know, well, this actually didn't happen. So this is just a little red herring. I was like, but let me see how we play it out. And
Hmm.
basically, we're just watching it just because we just want to see the depressed look on Dominic West's face again. It's like, I remember when you were McNulty. Come on, 25 years ago, we're watching The Wire. Not 20 years ago, we're watching The Wire. Did we think,
Yeah.
oh, that guy's going to be Prince Charles? It's something we're going to watch one day.
I
Um,
loved his character too. I mean, I'll leave it at that. I loved his. I don't know how behind closed doors accurate it was, but I loved his portrayal of Charles in
he
this.
did have, he took a part that was in many ways, I don't want to say a thankless role, but maybe not a role that one would be like, oh, it's going to be a fun one, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a remarkably good job considering that for the bulk of Charles's life, that people in the public eye, he was viewed rather negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't shy away from that here. And even in those private moments, some of them, he seemed like a genuinely, oh, you kind of like, you like Charles. But just as many times you're like, Charles can be just as fucking weird and petty as any of them, or even worse, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I could feel at least the pain of a situation of not being able to be, truly public and with Camilla for so many years. Because there's one thing I learned from this series because I never delved into to that extent is how long that situation had been going on for. I wasn't aware of it
Mm-hmm.
because that's not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's also funny to point out that, we talk about how the focus shifted to Charles and Diana. Then they kind of maybe padded that up, stretched it out a bit longer than I think they should have. And then all of a sudden it's William and Kate, which there was nothing wrong with the William and Kate stuff. It was just like, okay. It just felt compared to those earlier, it felt really light. It's like, okay, that's nice. It's a little teenage drama or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
that's cute and can this episode be about like three other things as well? Can you give me like a Downton Abbey or the Gilded Age? By the way, I just finished the first season of Gilded Age. That's a very good show. And
Oh, my niece is on that.
oh wow, very nice. Juggling some other storylines here instead of feeling just dominated by this, which is just kind of feels like lightness beyond light. But it's also funny to point out that, and maybe it's because the show is called The Crown, so they really were focusing on people who were really close in line to being the next in The Crown, is
Mm,
that the almost complete avoidance of ever dealing with Prince Andrew.
hmm
Um, like if you were to go onto IMDb and look up, the Prince Andrew character and the person who played him in his later years, and you'll see he's listed as being in 13 episodes. And I'd be like, I'm sorry.
Was he?
I'm telling you, I clicked on it, whatever. If you're not in the episode, you won't be listed for the episode. You didn't appear. You realize he's basically a background actor in like most of them. I don't know if he has more than 10 lines in the entire series. And if you ask me,
hmm
could you name it? No, I can't. Then there's Prince Edward, who was already somewhat inconsequential back then anyway, because he was lower on the pecking order. I was like, wait, Prince Edward's on the show? I don't remember. Again, I get that, where the focus went, Charles, Diana, whatever. But at the same time, they're brothers, they're her sons, and we really never see them. And they had to be there quite often, at least at some point. Now, I get the Andrew thing because of obviously, I think everyone listening is probably somewhat aware of all the scandals that have gone on with Prince Andrew over the years. And I think they just wanted like, you know what? Although we want to make really fun and dramatic TV here, maybe
Let's
we don't
skip
want to,
that one.
maybe we don't want to touch this one because now we're getting into allegations and this and that. And then, either someone killed themselves in prison and blah, blah, blah. But I was very curious because we mentioned the succession to the throne. So I did try to figure it out. And it was interesting seeing that, like, here, let me find it here. Scandal, da, 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 da. So, royally minded. Okay, so Prince Edward at one point he was third in line, and now he's 13th. So, forget you.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. And Andrew, who was clearly second at one point, but based on obviously the children that William has had and so on, he's been bumped down to eighth. First of all,
Probably still not going
yeah,
to
I don't, yeah, I'm surprised someone hasn't, taken Andrew out at this point.
happen.
And if anyone is wondering, Harry has actually fallen to fifth, but because the people that are in line ahead of him are basically children, Harry will just continue to collect the proceeds from his book tour, and I don't think he'll be sitting on a throne unless some really horrific tragedy should happen to the royal family.
Yeah. I think that Charles, I was thinking about, I was talking to my older son and his girlfriend last night about that she's been watching this show. You know, I, Charles has got two sons in this series who are about my son's ages.
Wow.
Um, and so I felt a little bit of that bit where he's talking about when he and Diana were together and like living in that little house together. Was it them that was talking about? Oh no, I'm sorry. It was no, who was that? Was it was it Elizabeth and Philip that were telling that story? I don't know. The whole bit at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was, I know what you're talking about. It
It's like
was
the
the Queen.
happiest moments of our lives.
I think the Queen was telling the story.
Queen
Elizabeth
was
was
telling
telling
the
the story
story. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
William, actually, I
But-
think.
yeah, to William. And so like I liked that whole, like sort of setting up the next generation for happiness, and I think that's some of the again, it's like a lot of this ending episodes of the season. It's this reminiscence of when they were young and what their lives were like. And I think I think that final scene of like Harry and Kate, I'm sorry, William and Kate, like in that apartment. And they have like all the friends just like making dinner like around the table and so on. So I think, oh, these people are just going to be normal people, even though they're not going to be normal people. But like,
Right.
they're going to try to live a normal life.
Oh, also, one of the really nice, if I can, as we're getting to the close of talking about the season at least, if not the show overall. Another thing I really liked about the season, just because I like the contrast of going across the generations, like you were saying, the number of scenes between the Queen and William, and
Mhm.
kind of skipping the ineffectual generation that was his dad. But what I liked about it, and again, I'm talking just for the court, why I'm watching any TV series. It's about watching characters that I find interesting or compelling and how they interact and the dynamics between them. And the knowledge of her at best strained relationship with his mother, and the fact there is so much of his mother in him, and they hit that on the head. They hit that
Mhm.
on the head a few times. But even I am aware of that. I've heard that before over the years, that he certainly is far more similar to his mom than his dad, and so on. And seeing how these two, grandma and him are able to bond this way, there was something just kind of pleasing about those scenes. And again, you mentioned it before, that you cast because they're young, so if they're just by being very young actors, they're by nature, by definition, somewhat unknowns. The dude acquits himself rather well. I thought the guy playing
Mhm.
William, what's his name? Is it Ed? I have it here. Ed McVeigh. Um, really does a nice job. I mean, the kid playing Harry is also good too, although I wonder at what point in Harry's life his hair got kind of permed. Um, I also think they gave William a break by cutting it by 2010, because it's like, so what
That's when
year
he starts losing his
what
hair.
year did that hair start disappearing? Because that hair looks really good right there. I'm not going to go look up what William looked like in 2010, but he should be really happy with his depiction. It's like, take it from me, dude. I, I, I,
Right
I,
there with you.
I, so, you know, again, I think the one thing I know we're in definite agreement about. This is a series that started really strong, was really solid for its first four seasons, probably less so in its last two. That's also the nature of the material that they're dealing with, and just even though it's historical fiction, it's historical fact, which kind of held the show back from being as good as it was in its first four seasons, because there's only so much you can make up, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, I'm kind of torn between which season and which era of Queen Elizabeth I like the best on this series. I'm temp. I mean, on one hand, I love Olivia Colman so much as an actress; it's hard to pick anyone over her. But that those earlier seasons with Claire Foy, especially her interacting, specifically Winston Churchill, who still remain to me, with all the prime ministers, still remains one of the most towering figures just in history, period, in British history, but also in the series. I mean, Lithgow knocks it out of the park, and he's like a foot and a half taller than Winston freaking Churchill, and we never give that any thought. Like, but he's like a little toad, and Winston Churchill's like a crane or something. I don't know, but I think it's those first two seasons really, and it's funny because I love Prince Philip so much more in seasons 3 and 4. But I think the overall storylines, and it's what you were talking about, which had much more bigger global implications, happen in those first two seasons. Maybe it's because we're still dealing with, there's wars raging on in the world. We're just coming out of World War II, and we have other things happening as well. Maybe that's why. But,
Hmm.
I think that first podcast when we first encountered the series, I don't think there was like one negative thing we had to say about it.
Hmm.
Because I'm remembering even things like, hey, remember that character Pip Torrens played? He was great. They never had a character that good again on the whole show. Remember Pip?
Yeah, I think the Coleman. I'm sorry, not the Coleman, the Claire Foy early seasons are still my favorites, and I think it's diminishing returns over time.
Yeah,
But but again, like I said, through this conversation, I have more of an appreciation now than I think I had when we started this conversation of how they stuck the landing on
right.
it and where they needed to. It was going to be a big challenge on narratively where to end this show, and I think they picked the good spot for it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Because when we talk, obviously on this podcast, we talk about TV, and we talked about over the years, there's been so many shows that had their final episode. But the one thing most of those shows had in common were, well, they weren't shows that were based on any, actual historic figures and real life, etc. They might incorporate real life into them, like say like The Americans did, or even Mad Men did to a certain
Hmm.
extent, whatever. But there was never, and even, and those shows, oddly enough, would get things really right when they had to. The details were always like, oh, that's actually a really smart little detail. Like, us working in the business that we used to, like, and on my end, I worked specifically with ad agencies. So that's why I probably have an even greater appreciation for Mad Men, because like, oh, I know all about McCann Erickson and all these guys,
Yeah,
whatever. I know about that Coca-Cola commercial, and that's how they were able to get away with that. That's like, that's very funny. But we always talk about how all those series stuck. Either they stuck the landings or not. And what the issues were going into. Either the shows that ended with, oh, are they going to kill somebody or not? Or is the final result going to be tragic or positive? Blah, blah, blah. Are they going to reach that goal they were always trying to reach or not? Will they go out with a bang or a whimper? Blah, blah, blah. This is the rare show that we watch where it's like, okay, we know where the actual story ends.
hmm
Are they going to go there? And we've been talking about that since, the princess, how they're going to deal with Princess Diana, never mind. But, when we were first talking about this show a few years ago, the Queen and Philip were still alive,
hmm
and I'll admit, once those two died, especially the Queen, one of my early thoughts were, oh, I wonder if they're going to incorporate that into the show.
I, I was exactly the same. That like, what does that do for the writing now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
how do you handle that? And as we just spent a chunk of time talking about, I thought they took a really smart approach to it. And we basically, it's like, and as you said, it's like we got the funeral without having the funeral. And
Mhm.
the more I thought about it after I watched, the more I was like, you know what? I can't think of anything different I would have recommended they do for that. That's a point. If this is the point in time where this would have been a thing to talk about, that's when it worked.
hmm
We don't. We all know what happened in the later things. We didn't need to get. I'm sure Meryl Marco is going. Wait, you're not even going to get to me at all? Really? Really?
Yeah, what about me?
What? But I'm on Suits at this time. No one was watching it. You're going to put that in there somewhere. Anyway, alrighty then. So, yeah, I think it's time we can draw the curtain on The Crown. Um, you know what? A very good Netflix series. I'm not going to say it's the best of the Netflix series I've watched over the last 15, 20 years, but those first few seasons definitely were. Alrighty then. Ow, I just hit my elbow. So anyway, if you enjoyed this podcast, guess what? You'll also enjoy hanging out on our Facebook page. You can look us up. It's a Series TV Drama Podcast page. You can like the page, and then you can join the conversation about shows like The Crown and so many others. We are available on most, if not all, podcast platforms. You can just Google Series TV Drama Podcast. You'll find us everywhere. But if you want to go where all the episodes can be found, all 397, just go to podbean.com. They're all there. Maybe the search engine isn't the greatest, but you know what? Me and Kimber also are used to working for companies that have bad search engines. Nothing new there. And if perchance you ever happen to use Apple Podcasts, feel free to pop on there just to rate and review us. Better still, screw this podcast. Scott forgot the 80s. Go there and rate and review that. And also, remember that the word is DeLorean, not Dolores, and maybe correct yourself when you're posting an actual review. Anyway, so
Oh my God.
now you can also find us on Instagram. Serious TV Drama is one word. And you can find us on what I call X Twitter. We're still there, because, Elon Musk, yay. You can find us there at STVD Podcast, STVD as in Serious TV Drama. Now, I know this is going to be the last podcast we will be recording before, the Christmas holiday. So for our Gentile friends,
Mhm.
want to, and Kimber too. I want to wish y'all a Merry Christmas, and hopefully this was a nice little present you'll find under your podcasting tree. Kimber, thank you. And then obviously next week me and Brian will be back with the next episode of Fargo as we close out the year. And when we move into 2024, we will be getting to the best of 2023 podcast, which I suspect it's almost going to be unavoidable. But did I work it out that way? I didn't mean to, but I'll take credit for it. Our 400th podcast should also probably be the best of 2023.
Nice.
I don't think there's enough material to make them into two podcasts. So we'll just do it as just one big, extravaganza. Kimber, thank you so much for your patience. We were supposed to record hours earlier, but apparently I dozed off. It's a miracle I woke up at all.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity talking about this show over the last couple of years. So I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Oh yeah, and you know what? I
I'll
like
have to find another show now.
We will. I like that you brought it tonight. One of my favorite things, which doesn't happen often enough on this podcast, is when I don't necessarily agree with my co-host. But the funny thing is, it's the ultimate rarity where the other person is being more negative than me, because he's like, wait, he borrowed my playbook. I'm the one who's usually the negative
That's me.
one.
I'm the negative guy.
Kimber, once again, thank you so much for joining. Happy holidays to you and happy holidays to everybody out there. If you want to say something to say goodbye to everybody before I hit the click button, feel free.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.